Hi guys, it's Kelly and I am here doing a card for another Casing Genius, and this card is casing Lydia Evans, and I'm going to be using Addie's Garden by Winnie and Walter, and then also the big, the bold, the big, the bold. I always do this. Why do I start these voiceovers? The big, the bold, and the extras. So as you can see from my desk, I had been playing around with my placement for a little bit, and here I forgot to show you, I'm using Sunshine Layers by W+9. And I'm also stamping in there pure black dye ink because I'm going to watercolor the background, and this is waterproof. So I had played around just on copy paper over, you can see on the left hand side, to get my guide of where I wanted to place my flowers. And my masks are also just copy paper and Tombow Mono multi-glue. So I just stamped everything out, masked it, stamped it. I was able to accomplish the whole card with just having one stamp for each image. One stamp for each image, one mask for each image. That makes much more sense. So here I'm just finishing up that masking, and I just absolutely love the magic that happens when you get to remove all those masks and see your whole kind of panel or scene or whatever you've created underneath it. It's awesome. So I am going to be doing, like I said, some watercoloring. Lydia had done a beautiful like ombre watercolor on 2 of her cards. So I decided I wanted to do that in blue, and I'm going to be using Chipped Sapphire, Mermaid Lagoon, Salty Ocean, and Peacock Feathers Distress ink. And at this point I thought that Chipped Sapphire was going to be my darkest color. It wasn't. I ended up adding some black soot. But I just smush them out on my Ranger craft mat, and then that way I can lay down some clean, clear water, and I'm just laying it down in the areas that aren't flowers, so whatever is the background. And I'm adding a good amount of water because I want those areas to stay wet long enough for me to add pigment to it. So I'm using a number 2 round brush by Artist Loft to get those little teeny tiny areas, and then I'm going to switch it up to a broader a flat brush, and I think that one that I'm using is actually from Ranger. It comes in their multi-pack, and then that way I can add lots of water to the top portion of the card that doesn't have any stamping on it. Somebody had asked me a question about how to get soft edges, that they were having a trouble getting edges that were really hard and not blendable. First of all, this is the way that I do all of my backgrounds because I like a more blended edge. And this is just what works for me. I put down a lot of clean, clear water. And it's hard when you're laying it down for the first time to make sure you're right up close to the edges. So just do the best you can, and then as you add pigment, you can see where the water line doesn't go all the way up to the stamped image. But I add in lots of clean water, and then I just keep making sure that area is saturated. And anytime you're putting down water in a large area like I am up here, I know I have to keep track of how wet it is. So on the bottom I added, you can see here, I'm working with quite a lot of water there, and eventually I will blot that off because it was too much water. I just wasn't getting good coverage with my pigment. But by adding in all of the clean water and dropping your pigment into that, you can see when I get up towards the top how beautifully it just blooms out, like right there. It's that water just carries it. I didn't have to do any work. I literally just touched the paintbrush to the water and it carried it out for me. And I love that look. That's, when I'm doing a watercolor, whether it be a background or an image, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for it to be effortless because it was. I mean, the water literally does all the work for you. So here I'm going in with the Mermaid Lagoon, and I'm going to be honest, I love the Mermaid Lagoon color as well as Salty Ocean, but in the watercolor arena, I didn't really notice any difference in the colors. It just didn't seem to be, I mean, they're very similar when you're just working with regular cardstock, but especially here, watercoloring them together, I didn't even notice them being a different color. So I probably could have just gone with one or the other and nobody would even know the difference. But there, see, now I'm going back in with clean clean water because my edges were starting to dry on me. So I wanted to make sure to get that soft edge. Just keep adding in clean, clear water, pushing your pigment back down. And then here, you know, when you go in with your next color, and this is peacock feathers, it will carry it out because it's still wet. Now, if I wouldn't have added in the extra clean water, it would have stopped because that paper had started drying on me. You know, large areas aren't going to stay wet forever. They soak it up pretty quickly. So I'm just going to continue building my colors. I'm just going from basically darkest to lightest, trying to figure out where I want my darkest edges to be, and just keep building them up. Like, that's what watercoloring is all about, is building those layers. And like I said before, here in a minute is probably where I'll bring in the black soot, just because I'm not getting dark enough contrast with the chip sapphire. Couldn't even think of the name of it. Totally just blanked on it. But yeah, I just think that it's a beautiful look, and especially for something like this, you know, where it's such a large area, to do this with my Copics, you know, to color in a background would have been an immense amount of ink, and I'm just not willing to to let it go, because, you know, you have to pay for all of those refills versus just, you know, throwing a little bit of distress ink on the paper and being done with it. On the paper, on the craft mat, on the craft mat. So I'm adding in that black soot, and then I'm going to continue to add darker pigment with the chip sapphire and the salty ocean and peacock feathers. I did go ahead and time lapse that because it's such a it's just so long. I mean, watercoloring anything takes a really long time. So this is basically all done, and Lydia had used some beautiful gold spatters, and I don't know what she used, but I don't have whatever it is. So I decided to go with some gold perfect pearls, and here I'm like randomly looking around my desk for anything I could scoop some of this powder out with, and those scissors just happened to be there and be it. So I'm using lots of water to mix that up, and then I'm just going to splatter it around the page. I wasn't really worried about getting it on my flowers because I thought I could blot it up. Guess what? You cannot. You can't. I tried wiping it off. It doesn't work. Don't do that. In the end, after I was done with my coloring, I did add more gold spatters over the flowers, so it wasn't that big of a deal for me. But if you want them to be pristine, mask them. So this is, I'm using some YGs to do my leaves. Again, I'm not going to show you every leaf because I color them all the same. I start with my lightest color, worked out to my darkest color. I usually work within 4 colors, and just when you're coloring, be aware of how those leaves lie. So not only are they shaded themselves, but also they're behind flowers. So be aware that those areas are also going to be darker. I'm just using small flicks of color, darkest to lightest, or lightest to darkest, darkest to lightest, and then darkest to light. Anyway, I go light to dark, and then in the reverse order. That's what we're doing. So I did have to speed up the coloring to about 3 times because I wanted you to be able to see each flower at least 1 time in case you have this set and have questions about how to color it. Here with this largest one, you can see some of the petals actually curl in on each other. So be aware of that, you know, it's going to be darker in the center because those petals are curling up and over the center. So I'm starting with my lightest color. I'm using very little flicks, and then I'm going in with my medium color. When I go in with my lightest the first time, I'm only laying down my shadows, and then I'll use the next color to cover over that. And you'll see when I get to the darkest color finally, I still have super white edges. And it's because I don't want to get too dark. That's just how I have given myself a little safety check so that everything doesn't become so dark there's no contrast and no highlight. I'm a person who, if I start with my darkest colors, I will just eat my highlight. I'll eat it up. Yum, yum, yum. It's gone. So here I'm going in with the VO4, which I got to tell you is one of my favorite purples. It's super bright. It's not very desaturated. It starts with a 0. Anything that starts with a 0 is going to be very bright. And I'm just going in where I believe that it's going to be the darkest, and where those petals lay on top of each other, and doing little flicks of color on the ones that are on the outside that are the smallest. I'm not even doing flicks. I'm just outlining the edge with a very fine line. And then for the darkest color, except for the very center, I am pretty much just putting down one small line and then moving on to the next petal, because I don't want to overwhelm it. I still want that flower to look like it has layers. And if you, like I said, put on too much dark, you're not going to have any contrast, and it's going to look flat. It's just going to look like a big dark blob on your card, and nobody wants that. Here I was leaving the center open because I thought that it was stamen, but I actually think it's petals, and I ended up going back and doing that purple or violet. That's what I'm using, the violets. And then when I go back in with my second layer, I go out just a little further. So I will go over the darkest, the color that was before it, whatever was darker, and then I'll go out just a little beyond that. And you can start to see that I'm filling in that white space now. So yeah, I mean, it's just basically the same thing repeated, but they're all different flowers and all different shapes, and your approach has to be different for each one as far as where your shading goes. So that's why I wanted to leave them in. And this is a little bit of a longer video. It's like 20 minutes long. But if you're just beginning with Copics, it's nice to have a point of reference for what exactly you're doing. So you can see on some of the smaller petals out there, there's almost no white left. That's okay. I'm still going to go over it with my lightest color because Copics are transparent and they layer on top of each other. So if you put a lighter color over a darker color, it's going to pull up some of that pigment. So it's still worth it to conserve what that little bit of white space is and hit it anyway. So this is just, finishing it off. This portion of it's really super quick because you're just going over the tippy tips of all of the petals, and then you're done. We're moving on to the next one. For this top rose, this is one of the flowers that I had tried to wipe off that Perfect Pearls, and it didn't work. So I thought, well, I'll just cover it. I'll just color it yellow, so then maybe that would cover it up. It did end up working. And again, this is a smaller image, so I'm almost doing no flicking. I'm almost just doing complete lines throughout the whole thing for my first layer. And this image has always given me trouble. I think that it's a beautiful image. It's the rose from the Big Bold and Extras, and it's the reason that I bought the Big Bold and Extras, so I could have this flower. But for some reason, I've just never really been happy with the way that I shaded it. So I was kind of taking my time and really looking to see where I wanted my darkest colors to be that would make the most sense. Smaller images are always just much harder to color. You don't have a whole lot of area to work in to get good blending from color to color. So I found what works best for me is just doing those little lines. And then when I work in the reverse order, again, I'll go out a little farther than I did the first time around to start filling in some of that white space. And that seems to work pretty well for me. I'm pretty happy with those results. Yellows can be kind of tricky too, just because you got to get a color in there that's going to give you some depth, where a lot of the yellows that I own are super bright. So I didn't, I'm not going to do the other rose because you just saw me color it, and I used the same color combination that I did for the violets. Here I'm doing the daffodils. I decided to do them white with a yellow-orange center, and the reason that I did that is because after I colored that rose yellow, I realized I could not put a yellow daffodil right next to it, and I was like panic-stricken searching the internet, like, oh my god, please tell me these daffodils come in some other color because I could be in trouble. So I did end up finding the white with the yellow centers, and I thought those were really pretty. With my white, I got a little heavy-handed with my gray shadows. So in order to fix that, I just went back in with my my Zero, the colorless blender, and that just cleaned it up, and it was no problem. Because I was a little nervous I was going to have a gray flower, which is not so pretty. So coloring that center, you just want to make sure, because it's opening up, that you colored your darkest portion into the center of the flower and not on the edges where it would be lightest. For this one, I don't know if it's a it's a sunflower mum thing. I don't know. It's super pretty, and it has all these little delicate petals on the bottom. When you're coloring this flower, make sure you're careful to leave the tops of that lighter. And this I'm going to be doing with some RVs, and I can tell you right now the ink that I used is waterproof, which is W+9's Pure Black, but it is not Copic friendly. So as you can see here, you couldn't really see it in any of the other ones because they had larger areas, but because there's so much black concentrated in the bottom portion, I'm getting like a little bit of a purple because I'm pulling some of that black. I knew I was going to be going over it with heavy, pinks and everything else, so I wasn't concerned about it. But if that is something that concerns you, don't do it. Anytime I got a little bit of black or whatever on my tip, I just scrubbed it off on a scrap sheet of paper. And it, like I said, it wasn't an issue for me. I don't feel like it affected the final image, and it was fine. So again, just make sure when you're going through, you're leaving those tips lighter toward the base, because you want to be able to see those. And in real life, they wouldn't all just be one mush of dark color. They would be lighter where they were standing up from the other petals. That was a weird little jump there. Sorry about that. But anyway, so now we're going to be going with the darkest one, which is super dark. It's a RV69. But it gives really good contrast to all those bright pink colors. And I'm just, doing the same thing. Laying down just little flicks of color. I'm not getting heavy-handed with this darker one. And then when I go back through, I'll go out just a little farther than I did before. Your darkest color should be your shadows and your lightest color should be your highlight. The main two colors that you're going to see are whatever mid-tones that you choose to use. So just going back through those really quickly. And then the next flower, and I don't even know what this one is, I'm not going to lie. I did the same RVs, but since it was a different shape, I wanted to leave it in anyway, just so I could show you, what I did with that. So finishing off that lightest color, and then we're going to go right into the next one. Still starting with my lightest color, small flicks of color. Make sure you're following the shape of the petal. And then this one on the bottom, it has petals that like bloom out. So the tips are going to be the lightest, and the darker shading is going to be in the center where it's closer to the base of the flower. So for this one, I did shade the tops and the bottoms of the petals. That's normally how I prefer to color my flowers. The other one, it just didn't make sense to do it that way. So just going in and adding that shading. For the ones that roll out, you want to make sure that you're reversing the area of your shading. So like here, I'm, shading the tops and the bottoms there. You just want to shade the base of it because the tip of the petal where it rolls out is actually going to be the lightest. So adding in those little flicks of color, and this just doing the tops and bottoms of the petal just helps to give it a more rounded look so that the light appears as if it's shaping that flower so that it's a round bloom, which is the appearance of what this one gives. Going into my darkest areas with the RV69. And I do add just a few little flicks to the top because I feel like it helps to round it out. You could not add it there, and I'm sure it would be perfectly fine, but that's just my preference. And again, going out just a little bit further than we did before, completely covering that RV69. And then here with the RV04, almost completely covering the whole thing because the lightest color, the RV02, is just going to be our highlight. So that's pretty much going to cover the whole coloring, and from here we're going to move pretty quickly because it is such a long video. I know it is. I'm sorry. I decided to do my sentiment. I'm using the Doodle Buds dies. That's the Blestus from the dies, and then also the stamp set. And I'm going to combine the two. Lydia had a beautiful gold foil embossed sentiment, so I decided to do the faux chipboard. I stacked about 4 of these together and then put the foil right on top of that so that it would stand up on its own. And then I used just the bottom portion of the sentiment in the set that's called Blessed to Call You My Friend, and added some sequins, and that pretty much finishes up the card for us. So thank you so much for joining me, and I hope that you have a wonderful day. See you later. Bye.